When the Roswell Daily Record ran the headline, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region on Tuesday the 8th of July 1947, they can't possibly imagine that they would kickstart a controversy that would go on for the next 70-something years. And yet, with that simple but bold declaration, they did exactly that. In the decades since, there have been rumours of conspiracies and cover-ups, recovered alien bodies, advanced technology stemming from reverse-engineered ET tech, secret underground bases and testing grounds. Oh, and of course, the idea that the whole thing was mistaken identity. The story became so iconic that other famous UFO cases based elsewhere are dubbed that area as Roswell. But what really happened? Today, for the first UFO episode of Series 2, we're digging into the granddaddy of them all, Roswell's Roswell. The Roswell incident. Let's get weird.
The history of mankind is riddled with the weird and the wonderful. Bizarre people, strange places, and odd events. For centuries, we've told each other fantastic stories around campfires and in darkened rooms. Tales of ghosts, UFOs, and conspiracies. But are these stories exactly that? Stories? There's only one way to find out. Dive into the rabbit hole and enter Marc W. Shako's Weird World.
Hello and welcome to the first UFO case of Season 2 of Weird World, and it's the world famous Roswell incident. We'll look at the official timeline, eyewitness accounts, and dig into some of the questions of what really went down in the New Mexico desert in 1947. Questions like, was it just a weather balloon? Was there a second crash site? Were there really alien bodies? If your interest in UFO cases is passing, some of the answers may surprise you. I'll admit, they surprised me. Just as a starter, I will say for this one that the dates are a little bit all over the place. One source says something happens on one day, another will put that same event on another date entirely. So, if you read somewhere that X happened on the Monday, not the Wednesday, or whatever, cool, make sure you let me know by giving this episode a like and saying nothing whatsoever in the comments. So, let's start somewhere near the time most places call the beginning. What happened? It's barely 2 weeks since Kenneth Arnold's famous flying saucer sighting. We touched upon that one briefly in episode 2. The link will be in the description. And the whole modern UFO phenomenon is about to get its most famous story yet. The year is 1947, just 2 years after the end of the Second World War. More people travel by train than by air, and will do so for another 8 years. Daytime television is still not a thing, with only primetime shows available. The town of Roswell, New Mexico is hardly known to, well, anyone. It's home to a 2-year-old Priscilla Presley and a 3-year-old John Denver, and famous for being the birthplace of Western legend Pat Garrett. During the still very recent World War II, a prisoner of war camp is located nearby, in Orchard Park. German POWs were used to do agricultural work, particularly during cotton season, and major infrastructure work like paving the banks of the North Spring River. Walker Air Force Base was located 3 miles south of the central business district of Roswell, New Mexico. Opened in 1941 as an Air Army Corps flying school, it was active during World War II and the post-war era as Roswell Army Airfield, RAAF. The 509th Composite Group relocated to Roswell in November 1945. During the war, they had a base on Tinian and had the unfortunate distinction of conducting the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, in August of that year. The town is home to 2 radio stations and 2 newspapers, and now the war is over, things are quiet, but not for long. It's on July the 7th that local rancher Mac Brazel contacted the sheriff in Roswell to say he'd discovered strange debris spread over his ranch. He'd found it days earlier but hadn't thought much of it until the stories about flying saucers emerged. Brazel was doing the rounds on the ranch near Corona, New Mexico, around 75 miles to the northwest of Roswell, when he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. He was checking on livestock following a violent storm when he found something most unusual. Sheep were refusing to cross part of the grazing land. It's only when he looks closer he sees shredded pieces of metallic-looking material scattered across the unforgiving terrain of the New Mexico desert. The debris field is 300 feet wide, 3/4 of a mile long, with a gouge down the middle. Unsure of what to do with the material, he collected it in his pickup and stored it, later driving the wreckage the 80 miles into Roswell and handing it over to the sheriff, George Wilcox. The sheriff was baffled as to the next steps. For this, there was no protocol. He reached out to the Air Force, who sent Major Jesse Marcel to investigate. Marcel, an intelligence officer from the base, was accompanied by Sheriff Wilcox and Mac Brazel, who returned to the site to retrieve the wreckage. What Marcel described was a paper-thin material like aluminium foil, but this was no ordinary foil. While the metal was easy to bend and fold, no matter how much you bent it, or how many times, it would instantly revert back to its original shape. Despite the late hour, Major Marcel was so impressed with whatever this strange material was, he stopped off at home around 1 a.m. on the way back to the base to show his wife and son, Jesse Jr., what he's found. When Major Marcel and the material arrived back at the base, Public Information Officer Walter Hout receives shocking information and is tasked with working with a local journalist to put out a Newswire report. And boy did they. The Newswire report went as follows. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavez County. The flying object landed on a ranch near Roswell sometime last week. Not having phone facilities, the rancher stored the disc until such a time as he was able to contact the sheriff's office, who in turn notified Major Jesse A. Marcel of the 509th Bomb Group Intelligence Office. Action was immediately taken and the disc was picked up at the rancher's home. It was inspected at the Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Marcel to higher headquarters. As you'd expect, the news sent shockwaves around the world. But it's the front page headline of the Roswell Daily Record that really put the alien amongst the space pigeons. RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The space shit well and truly hit fans the world over. Just as minds were exploding worldwide, it was a mere 24 hours later that the now infamous UFO cover-up excuse for the ages was born. The US military said there had been a mistake, and that the people involved in the story had mistaken a vehicle from another planet for a crashed weather balloon. So there we are, folks. After all that, it was actually just a weather balloon. Thanks for listening. Next time on Weird World. I jest. From Roswell, the debris had been flown to Fort Worth in Texas. The commander of the 8th Air Force there, General Roger Ramey, got involved. According to the new, improved version of events, the saucer was just a weather balloon carrying a radar target, which is a device like a box kite, made of foiled paper fastened to a balsa wood frame. The Roswell Morning Dispatch ran the news story on the 9th of July. Army debunks Roswell flying disc as world simmers with excitement. Accompanying the news story were a series of photos showing Ramey, Marcel, and other military personnel presenting the debris. Sure enough, it looked entirely uninspiring, consistent with the tin foil mentioned by the military in their weather balloon explanation. These elite personnel, many of whom were familiar with weather balloons, closely associated with the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic bomb-capable squadron anywhere in the world at the time, had been mistaken. In 1994, it was revealed that the balloon which had crashed near Roswell was no ordinary weather balloon. It belonged to a top-secret project named Project Mogul. Mogul was an attempt to detect Soviet missile launches and nuclear blasts, and due to the high levels of secrecy around the project, authorities in 1947 had no option but to cover it up. I'm sure you can envisage scenes of 1947 Roswell with pitchforks and torches and marches through town and a scared and confused townsfolk demanding answers. But this isn't our skeptical social media world. This is post-war America in a patriotic military town. This was a time when people trusted authority. The weather balloon explanation was almost universally accepted. While interest in flying saucers and little green men took off in the minds of the public, the Roswell incident simply disappeared for about 30 years. That is, until the story of Roswell was rediscovered in 1978 by nuclear physicist turned ufologist Stanton Friedman. Friedman had received a tip that a retired military man had a fascinating tale to tell about the Roswell incident. The military man in question was none other than Jesse Marcel. Marcel told Friedman that everyone involved in the retrieval of the debris was clear the object had not been of this earth. He said that the weather balloon explanation was nothing more than a cover story. The photos from the day after debunk had been staged. The real wreckage had been swapped out with bits of actual weather balloon, and the Roswell story was alive and well. Jesse Marcel Jr. qualified as a doctor. He flew helicopters in Vietnam. He's a sensible, down-to-earth man, but that night in Roswell has never left him. He says that his father admitted to being part of the cover-up, that the thing they found in the field was no weather balloon. In fact, there was evidence something strange was going on from the very beginning. According to the Roswell Daily Record for the 8th of July, that's right, the very same edition that kick-started the whole controversy in the first place, a man who worked in hardware in Roswell, Dan Wilmot, and his wife witnessed something they struggled to explain. On Wednesday the 2nd of July, this date I can confirm from the newspaper article, the Wilmots were sitting on their porch at around 10 p.m. when they spotted a large glowing object which zoomed out of the sky at a high rate of speed. The sighting lasted less than a minute. Wilmot estimated the object was moving between 400 and 500 miles per hour. Whatever this thing was, it looked like two inverted saucers faced mouth to mouth. The entire body glowed. According to the article, Wilmot was one of the most respected and reliable citizens in town, and he kept the story to himself, hoping that someone else would come forward. When nobody did, he could hold his tongue no longer. But it's the last paragraph of the story which is the most interesting. Quote, "The announcement that the RAAF was in possession of a flying disc came only a few minutes after he decided to release the details of what he had seen." End quote. Could this object be connected to whatever Mac Brazel found? Later, in 1993, another witness came forward saying he and his father witnessed something around the same sort of time, though this could easily be dismissed as bandwagoning. But something else came out in later years. The site of the crash wasn't the only crash site. There was a second. And it's this second site where the really interesting stuff happened. At the time of the Roswell incident, Frankie Rowe was a 12-year-old girl. Her father was a fireman in Roswell. Mr. Rowe was a regular, hard-working, blue-collar guy, so when he came home excited, it was notable. He told Mother to gather the kids because he had a story to tell, and it was of more than a crashed flying object. They were called out to what they thought was a plane crash, which brought with it the risk of grass fires, but when they got there, they found something quite different. When they arrived, there were 2 bodies beside a crashed vehicle. They were around the size of 10-year-old children. There was a third wandering around in a daze. Mr. Rowe found this part of the story difficult to tell because the third being was visibly upset at the deaths of his fallen comrades. "There's no need to be afraid," he told his family. "They're not here to hurt us." They had been there for a few minutes when the military arrived. The fire crew was told to leave. Frankie's mother seemed skeptical of the story, and for a couple of days that was that. Nothing more was said. A few days later, Frankie was at the firehouse after taking a sick day off school, and the topic came up again. A state policeman entered and gathered the fire crew around him. When everyone was there, the state policeman reached into his pocket, pulled out his fist and held it over the table. He opened his hand, and a wadded up piece of metal fell to the table and spread like water. Whatever you did to this metal, it returned to its previous form. It wouldn't burn, it couldn't be cut. A discussion broke out as to how bad the crash must have been for this piece to have come loose. Frankie played with it for a while, crushing and dropping the metal, watching it repair itself, saying when it was balled up in her fist, it felt like she was holding nothing. The state policeman said a few of the others had snuck bits of debris off the crash site, but they were always caught and forced to hand it back over. One of the many questions folks have around Roswell is why did the story die and disappear until Stanton Friedman started poking around? A good question. Anyone from Roswell at the time would have told you that this was a military town, a proud patriotic town. The silence makes perfect sense. But it makes more sense when you see and hear the emotional witness testimonies about threats and intimidation. The family of Sheriff Wilcox say military folks were down at the jailhouse intimidating and threatening the lives of his entire family, and that's just for starters. KGFL was one of the 2 local radio stations in Roswell, and they secured rancher Mac Brazel for an interview, even going so far as to hide him out at a station employee's house, just for safety. The next day the station received a phone call saying if any of the interview got out, their broadcasting license would be in jeopardy. Were similar threats made against Brazel himself? A neighbour called Brazel a man of integrity who felt used and insulted when he was told he had to pretend the material he saw was nothing special. Around 4 days after Frankie Rowe's experience playing with the material at the firehouse, late one evening a knock came upon their door. A military man asked to speak to the girl at the firehouse. More men took the rest of the kids out of the way into the backyard, while he took Frankie and her mother into the dining room, sat them at the table and stood over them. He tells Frankie not that the material was ordinary, but rather there was no material. She didn't see it, she didn't touch it. A 12-year-old girl raised to be honest and not used to being talked to in euphemism didn't understand the message. Instead, she swore blind she did see the material, did pick it up, folded it up. There was a back and forth, the military man insisting none of this happened, the honest kid insisting it did. Tensions rose and he pulled a nightstick off his belt and started pounding it into his hand, telling Frankie he'll take her and her siblings to the German POW camp at Orchard Park. He says that her parents will be taken to the Japanese POW camp miles away, or that the whole family would just be taken into the desert and never seen from again. The message was finally received. Frankie said nothing until after her parents were dead and author Kevin Randall questioned her about it. It took him around 2 years to persuade her to talk. Randall says he knows her father was at the crash site. He also obtained sworn affidavits from her sister that the intimidation meeting took place. Frankie Rowe's father talked about aliens, but he was far from being the only one. Another witness says her dad was stationed at Roswell in '47. He revealed to her that one day everyone was taken off base to visit the site of a crashed saucer. The men were told to look but not take in or pay too much attention to what was going on around them. He and a colleague were told to stand guard over a covered truck with a tarpaulin inside and warned under no circumstances were they to look underneath a sheet. Curiosity got the better of them. Underneath the sheet were two bodies, 4 feet tall with oversized heads. She recalls whenever he told the story, it only ever got as far as the appearance of the bodies and then the subject changed, no matter how much she and her sister pestered him. He told them never to tell anyone or he could get into trouble. Glenn Dennis worked for the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. His story goes further. The funeral home had a contract with a military base to provide funeral services. One day, he received a strange phone call. The base mortuary officer called just after lunch, asking what was the smallest hermetically sealed casket they had in stock. Glenn told them he thought 4 feet was the smallest, but he might be able to get them around 3.5 feet and asked what they needed it for. The reply came it was for possible future use. Barely an hour goes by and the phone rings again. The question comes now, what would you do to bodies that have been exposed to the elements? What preparations would you use, and what effects might these procedures have on the chemical composition of tissue and blood? Again, just for possible future use. Glenn answers and is going about his day a little confused, when around another hour later the phone rings for a third time. The mortuary has the town's only ambulance service, and he's asked to help an airman with minor injuries. He arrives to the scene of an accident to find an airman with a cut forehead and a broken nose. He patches him up and drives him out to the base. When he arrives at the infirmary, there are 3 old Army field ambulances parked in his usual spot, 2 of which have MPs standing guard at the back of them. As he walked the airman inside, he threw a glance inside the back of the parked field ambulances and saw stainless steel wreckage that looked like parts from a plane crash. Glenn was friendly with a nurse who'd worked at the base and wandered back to find her to buy her a Coke. When she emerged from an examining room, it was clear that all was not well. She had a handkerchief over her mouth and seemed surprised to see him, asking him, "What the hell are you doing back here? Get out of here, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble." She disappeared through another door and Glenn was standing beside it when a military man spotted him, asking what he was doing there. Glenn explained about the airman, that he was from the funeral home, and that as they usually helped with crashes, asked if they wanted him to prepare. The soldier called for 2 military police to escort him from the premises. Just as he got to the doors, a gruff voice called from behind, "We're not through with that son of a bitch, bring him back." He turned to see a mean-looking red-headed soldier who told him not to mention a word of what he'd seen, and certainly not to mention anything about crashes or he'd find himself in a lot of trouble. They'd be picking his bones from the sand. A black sergeant commented that Glenn would make great dog food. Glenn left. The next day Glenn was worried about his nurse friend and reached out to her. She wasn't available. She called later saying it was her day off and asked to meet. When she arrived, she looked like death and swore him to secrecy about the things she'd seen. Clearly shaken, her eyes wild and crazed like her sanity was hanging by a thread, she began to relay the events of the previous day. She was doing her routines and gathering supplies when a doctor told her to drop whatever she was doing because they needed help. When she got into the room, she was hit by a stench worse than anything she'd ever smelled. A sight so gruesome and horrific, she doubted she'd ever get it out of her mind. She said she wondered if she'd ever sleep again. At this point, Glenn is assuming a regular plane crash has taken place and says she'll have to get used to the horror she'd seen if she was to continue as a nurse. "You don't understand," she said. "This is something that no one's ever seen." She pulled out crumpled prescription notes and smoothed them out on the table. She'd made sketches of what she'd seen. A shorter upper arm, a longer forearm that led to a four-fingered hand, the tips of the fingers with small suction cups, a large head, large eyes, no ears, no nose, just holes, a slit for a mouth. When Glenn bumped into her at the airbase, she'd left the room because the smell was so overpowering she thought she might be sick. In all, she saw 3 bodies, 2 of which were mangled. They were working on the third, which was relatively intact. The doctors said they hadn't seen anything like it and there was no textbook for what they were doing. After, Glenn drove her back to the nurses' quarters. He never saw her again. One fascinating thing was, when being interviewed, Frankie Rowe says her dad wasn't at the Corona crash site. The Roswell fire crew wouldn't have gone there. Is it possible that there was another crash site? Turns out, yes. 175 miles to the west of Roswell, on the plains of San Augustine, reports came in with multiple witnesses. There was a second crash. Gerald Anderson and his family had just moved to Albuquerque in early July of 1947 and, as his brother had an interest in geology, his uncle wanted to take them to the plains of San Augustine. He, his brother, father, uncle and cousin drove as close as they could to the plains before setting out on foot. When the plains opened up in front of them, on the opposite ridgeline, something caught their eyes. A disc-shaped craft around 40 feet in diameter had embedded itself into the ridge, tailed by a trail of debris. In the shade of the craft were 4 bodies, 2 clearly dead, 1 injured, another sitting beside its injured friend. It was surrounded by small boxes like it had been administering first aid. The creatures were just as Glenn Dennis's nurse friend had described. They had been there for a while when a group of 6 arrived on foot. They were a group of geologists who had seen the crash the night previous, thinking they'd been witness to a meteorite. When they set out, they saw the flashes of shiny debris and thought they'd stumbled upon a plane crash. 15 minutes later, the air was filled with the hum of vehicles. Military vehicles. So many, it looked like an invasion force. Military men all pile out, among them a black sergeant and a gruff, mean, red-headed officer. The redhead threatened everyone, and they were chased from the site at gunpoint. Glenn tells his story with incredible levels of detail, and might sound far-fetched if not for the fact that multiple witnesses have been tracked down who were aware of, and friends with, the group of geologists. Links to videos with those interviews are in the description. And now, a word from our sponsor, which is me. Lights in the sky turn into a quest for the truth in the event, if you like your novels all X-Filey. Project Mogul is now the widely accepted reason for the official story of what really happened in Roswell in 1947. Only, there's a problem with it. The people involved are all high-level military with clearance to work on nuclear projects. Some of experience with other similar projects. Would they really get so carried away by a weather balloon? The top secret status of the project implies some sort of special equipment was used, but in reality, it's still no more than a standard neoprene weather balloon with those light, box kite-like radar targets attached. Something in use at the time for 20 years. It would be difficult to find someone working for the military near Roswell amazed by it. Would a major really drag his wife and kid out of bed at 1 in the morning to show them this? Eyewitness testimony from the family of Sheriff Wilcox revealed the sheriff and his deputies at the time were all talking about blackened grass at the crash site. If a balloon bursts and falls to Earth, how does anything burn? And would a balloon with light radar targets attached create a gouge in the Earth? The answer to both questions is no. So is Mogul a lie? Now, people might ask, how come aliens travelled all that way to Earth and then crashed? But that question jumps to a simple assumption of light years of travel. But the truth is, if it was aliens from another world, nobody really knows how they got here. Did they travel across the gulf of space in a linear A to B fashion, like we would taking a flight? Or would some Einstein-Rosen bridge wormhole shortcut be more likely? Maybe they didn't travel that far at all. What if they have underground bases here on Earth? Underwater bases? It's often said that we know more about space than our own oceans. And then the crash itself. Could some of our technology on Earth be so outdated to them it never even occurred they'd have to work around it when they got here? How many of our aircraft crashes here on Earth are put down to pilot error? According to the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, and the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, pilot error is cited in 60 to 80% of all aviation accidents. Shit happens. And then why did the government say it was a UFO and then correct that statement? This simple question is what everyone is asking, skeptics and believers alike. Could it be that the UFO word got out in Roswell, and when the suits upstairs in Fort Worth found out, they panicked and demanded the whole story be whitewashed? Colonel William Blanchard is the man responsible for the captured flying disc news story. His memo is what landed on the desk of press officer William G. Hort. He wrote the original press release. Hort points to the fact that there are so many people talking about Roswell receiving no money for their troubles. All they get is smears and ridicule. Yet still, they talk. They just want the truth out. A witness whose father worked alongside Colonel Blanchard in the 1960s described Blanchard as no fool, saying he was not the sort of man to put out news about a captured flying saucer unless he was absolutely certain. If Blanchard said there was a crashed disc, then there was a crashed disc. Over many years of stories, claims, counterclaims, debunks and rebunks, plain fact and disinformation, the waters of the Roswell incident are well and truly muddied. There will be those convinced that it was a crashed alien craft, and others who firmly believe it was nothing more than a weather balloon, and neither group will be swayed no matter what they hear about it. Me? I'm like the poster in Fox Mulder's office. I want to believe. That's all from me. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep it weird. The intro music is Slasher by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Check out his YouTube channel. The outro music is Lone Wolf by Guillaume Bernard. Please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review and share this episode wherever you may have heard it. And you can find me on Facebook and X as Marc W. Shako. For more information on my books and all things podcasty, visit www.markwshako.com. Thanks for listening.